I'm not going to beat around the bush here. Star Wars Outlaws completely fails in a lot of key aspects. Its stealth and combat systems are some of the worst that I've ever seen. The writing is at points bogged down by Ubisoft's recent approach to game design. Lip sync and facial animations are both, at times, terrible, and in that regard, the intense negative discourse surrounding this game is largely accurate. But what I feel like this discussion fails to nail down is that despite these shortcomings, the core of Star Wars Outlaws is an ambitious attempt from Ubisoft Massive to meaningfully adapt the open world formula, not only to a Star Wars setting full of rich lore, stunning visuals, and plenty of scum and villainy, but also a modern video game, as many, myself included, have grown tired of that stale open world bloat and busy work that has plagued these titles as of recent years. Before this game's release, I was cautiously optimistic of what Ubi Massive were attempting. I'm not the biggest Star Wars fan or anything, but I do have this reverence for the original films, as many others do, and I'll say, without a doubt, Outlaws absolutely nails that atmosphere more so than any other game before it, and at times exudes qualities reminiscent of the best that the setting has to offer through its world building and its exploration. It's true to say that if you really like Star Wars, you'll probably get a lot out of this, but if you've fallen out of love with the IP recently, it's also incredibly unlikely that Outlaws is going to be the thing that'll pull you back into the fray. So the question is then, is Star Wars Outlaws, with all of its flaws, and there are a lot of them, worth your hard-earned money in 2024? And the answer to that question is, it depends. And look, I know that's not very satisfying of an answer, but I promise I'll explain what I mean by that. Star Wars Outlaws is a bad stealth game. Its combat framework is underbaked and outdated, and its story can often feel constricted by its commitment to open-ended design. However, its atmosphere, beautifully crafted environments, and its effort to adopt systems that meaningfully evolve Ubisoft's tired open-world game design mean that Outlaws genuinely comes together as an ambitious and heartfelt Star Wars story that maybe, just maybe, might be worth it for some. I'm James Jensen for Reset Button, and this is my review of Star Wars Outlaws. You play as Vess, a scoundrel living, or more aptly surviving, in the casino city of Canto Bight, where she and her fuzzy companion Nix are left for dead after a heist gone wrong, leaving her on the run from the leader of newly formed crime syndicate Zerek Besh. With a bounty on her head and nowhere to turn, she finds herself entangled in the plights of warring criminal enterprises across the galaxy, and you get the gist. I actually want to get back to the story later, as I think it's quite interesting, but first I want to talk about something that Star Wars Outlaws does really well, that being its open world design. I think there was a reasonable amount of skepticism afforded to this game prior to release, as it is definitely an open world Ubisoft game, something that people have generally grown tired of over the past few years. Games like Assassin's Creed Odyssey and Far Cry 6, despite being generally well received, in my opinion, suffer heavily from the desire of the developers to cram as much content into them as possible. These games have such similar systems that despite their vastly different settings and gameplay, have a few recognizable traits across them, such as vantage points that reveal map locations and seemingly endless enemy encampments that you have to clear out. You know what I'm talking about. A lot of this content is content for the sake of it and feels quite mindless in my opinion. So the question is, how much of this open world bloat carries over to Outlaws? A little bit, but the game is largely devoid of many of the trappings of the standard Ubisoft affair. There are no towers here, there are barely any markers on the map, and the game is not 60 plus hours long. For reference, it took me around 25 hours doing a good chunk of side content. It feels like Massive really tried to iterate on the open world formula that Ubisoft is so well known for, rewarding you for engaging with the world and its systems rather than being fed an endless checklist of locations to clear and towers to climb. Don't get me wrong, there are map markers here, but instead of immediately cluttering your map with a slew of icons, Outlaws does something interesting. When you're traversing through the game's many beautifully rendered environments, cities and the like, you might overhear some NPCs discussing something like a hidden stash, or a shady deal taking place, or a lost item, and only then, after hearing the information, will a quest be added to your log. I know it doesn't sound like much, but what this means is that your Ubisoft checklist is only populated by scenarios that you're actually aware of, stripping back a lot of the bloat that tends to fill these games. These activities are pretty standard fare, open world base clearing or fetch quests, but the decision to pull back on these repetitive tasks feels a lot like a less is more approach, something I can appreciate for what it is. It's not just that. You can also find text logs scattered around the world that might tell you about a fixed horse race or a locked gate, and in the case of the races, you actually have to remember this information for later when you eventually go to make a bet. It's a small thing, but it actually rewards you for looking around and paying attention to what you find in the world, and it goes a long way at heightening that immersion factor that this game executes so well. Another example of a meaningful iteration of its open world design is the game's progression system. Typically, games like this will have a skill tree. You'll gain experience as you level up to unlock abilities, but the way that this functions in Outlaws is a little bit different. Certain things like the ability to lockpick specific doors or to do stealth takedowns on brute enemies, they're not given to you through normal gameplay or through unlocks, but instead through expert quests out in the world. These are NPCs that effectively function similarly to a skill tree, allowing Kay to unlock abilities over her journey, but these unlocks actually require you to engage with the open world and its systems. Really smart decision on the part of Massive. For example, unlocking the advanced slicing kit, that lockpick I mentioned before, had me tracking down an NPC in town after overhearing a discussion about them from two goons, which ended up being this intricate multi-step questline asking me to sneak into a cartel-controlled area for information and concluding with me stealthily raiding an Imperial base to rescue said NPC for the upgrade. It was a genuinely well-designed scenario, and all that for an upgrade to your lockpick that, as far as I can tell, is completely optional. That questline unlocked what is effectively a small skill tree, and getting subsequent upgrades, while perhaps not as intricate, encourages you to engage with the game's systems in a similar way. Some of these involve finding a particular item out in the world, while others rely on hitting specific stat milestones like land 15 headshots or something. There are 9 of these trees in total, all providing a reason to get out and engage with the open world outside of clearing map markers. Again, it's not groundbreaking, but it functions as an evolution of Ubisoft's open world formula, and for me, it's more than welcome. To compound this, maybe Star Wars Outlaws' crowning achievement is its complex and impactful take on a reputation system, thoughtfully dubbed the syndicate system. Throughout her travels, Kay is going to butt heads with the many crime lords lurking in these cities, be that the Pikes, or the Crimson Dawn, or even Jabba the Hutt, and will take on various contracts over the course of the game, most of which relate specifically to these crime families. As the warring factions fight for control over territory, and more importantly information, Kay has the opportunity to help or hinder these factions based on her affiliations. A lot of these missions involve simple activities like supplanting listening devices deep into enemy territory, but the game does a good job at weaving this reputation system into the main story missions as well. Say you're running a job for the Pikes and they've asked you to steal certain information from Crimson Dawn. You'll sneak into the compound, slice the info from a terminal, only to be contacted by the Hutts, saying they'll buy the information for a better price. Selling this information off will piss off Crimson Dawn no matter what, but pawning it off to the huts may offer you more credits, but your betrayal of the pikes will not go unnoticed. What these interactions result in is the changing of 4 separately functioning reputation meters, one for each of the factions, with different tiers representing your good standing with each of the cartels. Each of these tiers fundamentally changes the way that you interact with the world, as many areas on certain planets will be under mob control. Say you work hard to be in the good graces of the huts. Doing so will allow you not just to enter faction-controlled areas unimpeded, but cartel-affiliated vendors will often offer you better deals, rewards, and jobs. The inverse is true for poor reputations. Oftentimes syndicates will just shoot you on sight if you're found in their territory, making it much more difficult to complete certain quest lines. If your standing is poor enough, eventually the cartels will start to send hit squads after you in the open world. It's pretty interesting. These systems result in a careful balancing act when you're engaging these crime families. Certain jobs may be incredibly lucrative, but will almost always affect your standing with the other syndicates, meaning you have to be quite cognizant of K's reputation, lest being constantly hunted by the pikes like I was for most of my playthrough. What this means is that the game world often feels quite reactive. Open world games can have this problem where despite your actions as a player, they often feel quite static and unchanging, and I feel that this syndicate system does a really good job at alleviating some of that stiffness, giving weight to your decisions as you move throughout the galaxy. What this results in is the creation of a world which you feel you're genuinely a part of, not just a character moving through a set story. So that's some of the good. Let's get to some of the not so good.
Oh, quick!
Star Wars Outlaws is what I'd crudely describe as a scoundrel simulator, to which the building blocks are stealth and combat. Ubisoft Massive previously worked on the Division 1 and 2, both of which were largely devoid of stealth. You can tell. Those games are excellent in their own right, but the way that these encounters are designed here is clearly not from a studio with vast stealth expertise. There's just so much wrong here. K is obviously going to be outmanned and outgunned in most situations, meaning that you're facing up against tens of enemies at a time, often walking together in groups, and a lot of the time it's really difficult to sneak past enemies without being detected, or even to thin the herd for an easier time. You have 2 main options when it comes to dealing with enemies stealthily: a normal stealth takedown with a pretty rough animation when sneaking up behind someone, and a single shot taser on a very long cooldown, so you can only use it sparingly. Both of these generally work, but the problem comes when you're confronted with 4 or 5 enemies in these big spaces. Performing these takedowns is almost impossible without being detected. K can tell Nix to distract an enemy, but this doesn't help so much when there are so many foes about. Enemies also have these huge sight lines. Oftentimes you'll be spotted from really far away by an enemy you couldn't really see in the first place. This becomes a massive problem, really evident in the game's first open area where you're asked to sneak through a syndicate compound. But so many of these pathways that you're expected to go down are so heavily patrolled that it almost feels impossible at times unless you pick literally perfect opportunities to move. This coupled with these detection radiuses also feeling incredibly hard to predict throughout the whole game. The framework in which this stealth system sits is so fundamentally underbaked, it's seriously baffling as to how these systems made it into the game in this state. Especially considering that the stealth design in other Ubisoft games is generally okay, quite egregiously. A lot of these encounters, especially some of the more intricately designed story missions, have these instant fail states upon detection, which didn't happen to me very often. But man, it was frustrating when it did. The design here just feels really backwards, especially when you're forced to repeat large sections of these missions because of it. It's just boring. You have such limited options at your disposal to appropriately deal with some of the enemies you're going up against. There are no options to utilize the environment to your advantage outside of these predetermined smoke canisters that'll explode if you shoot at them, which will alert every single enemy in the area. I think you get the idea. The combat is like the stealth system, incredibly simplistic, lacking a lot of the dynamism and flexibility you'd think necessary in a game like this. Kay has her trusty blaster, with the ability to pick up other weapons dropped by enemies around the level or left on weapon racks and that kind of stuff. And yeah, none of them feel very good to use. And apart from their setting, the combat encounters don't really change over the course of the game. Enemy AI is maybe canonically really bad, where grunts will often just mindlessly charge towards you with no effort to flank or push you out of position or anything. Basically, the only options you have available is shooting your blaster, throwing a grenade, or really weird floaty melee combat, and like the stealth, there are no meaningful ways to interact with the environment. Enemies don't really change outside of maybe having a shield, and it really feels like we've taken 10 steps back here when it comes to Ubisoft's third-person shooter design. So the gameplay is really kind of laughably terrible in a way that almost doesn't make any sense. Ubisoft made Splinter Cell, arguably one of the most iconic stealth games of all time, and Assassin's Creed, and this very studio made The Division. So for Star Wars Outlaws to have one of the most unsophisticated stealth systems in any video game I've played, and boring, simplistic combat, it's just a real shame. So that's a lot, and I wouldn't blame anyone for hearing that and completely writing off this video game, but I would like to draw your attention to something else that I think that Outlaws does better than maybe any Star Wars game before it. The world it creates, or in some cases replicates, feels so alive and true to the Star Wars ethos. Coming face to face with Jabba the Hutt, moving through its cities, the hustle and bustle, the grit and the grime of the criminal underworld, I'd be lying if I said there wasn't something special here. As I said earlier, a lot of the time you'll hear people talking about things in the city, a hidden cache, a lost weapon shipment, that sort of stuff. And in that regard, the design of these spaces really sells that scoundrel fantasy in a way that I couldn't really have anticipated. Not just going toe-to-toe with various crime bosses, both new and old, you can also play Kessel Sabak, a simple but engaging card game that has its own progression system. You can move through its cities with their bustling markets, the iconic Mos Eisley Cantina on Tatooine, and witness firsthand the foothold that the Empire has on these spaces and the desire of the syndicates to undermine them for their own benefit. It not only thematically fits with Star Wars, but it's great to see an angle on these spaces typically reserved for TV shows, as the vast majority of these games that we've seen recently have focused much more heavily on the Jedi, which, fair enough, they are pretty cool. It's not just the cities though. Every space feels so meaningfully thought out. Again, the landscapes are strewn with faction-controlled regions, Imperial bases, pirate camps, farming towns, you name it. Moving through this world as well is often not as simple as just pointing your camera in the direction of your map marker and pressing forward like it is in other open world games. Some careful consideration has gone into creating spaces that you're often not able to move through absent-mindedly. They aren't confusing, they're just designed quite thoughtfully, actively encouraging you to look around for potential paths to take, becoming familiar with the map rather than just relying on the compass to get you where you need to go. The best touch point I have for this is Horizon Forbidden West, another open world game, where its spaces were designed in a way that was quite intricate, and as such, the moment-to-moment traversal actually became a large part of how that game played, despite sharing an open world. You actually had to use your eyes to look around for paths you could take, as the verticality of its environment seldom allowed you to just walk in one direction to get to your objective. Outlaws is similar, but I'd say that it's scaled back a fair bit. There's still a level of verticality to these spaces, but they're far less dense by comparison. That verticality often means that you'll be actively contending with the layout of the map when traveling to your destination. There are also plenty of obstacles, meaning that you can't really turn your brain off and just drive. What this leads to is a traversal system that is far more engaging than that of most open world games due to the spaces being laid out in a way that actively requires you to engage with it on its own terms. These spaces are also, unsurprisingly, breathtakingly gorgeous, with brilliant art direction that not only nails the Star Wars aesthetic to a T, but also presents some really beautifully designed natural scenery, with a good amount of variation in the mix. There are the arid plains of Toshara, the beautiful, lush jungles of Akiva, the cold, densely populated city of Kijimi, and everyone's favorite, Tatooine. These spaces just look incredible. The space sections, despite lacking some variety in the activities that they offer, are really breathtaking as well, though they are few and far between. Ubisoft Massive have put a massive amount of time and effort into realizing this world in a way that we just haven't seen before in this level of detail, and it's very clear to me that this was the primary focus of their development effort. Shit gameplay aside, the immersion factor of this living, breathing Star Wars world is by far this game's crowning achievement. It's really great in that regard. Now, the story. I briefly touched on this earlier, and I want to say that the way that this is structured almost makes it feel like two separate games. It starts off incredibly slowly, introducing you to Kay and Nix, Canto Bight, Toshara, and the game's systems, and after about 8 hours or so, you're unshackled and given the ability to explore the game's 4 main planets freely and to complete their quests in any order that you see fit. This is pretty typical of recent Ubisoft titles, and while I certainly didn't hate the structure here, the way that the plot unfolded in the first 2 acts definitely left a lot to be desired. Outside of a few standout missions, the entire Tatooine section comes to mind as being particularly memorable, the story suffers from an abundance of really forgettable, uninteresting characters that do little to actually push the plot of the game forward. This is a heist story, where Kay and Nix are tasked with putting together a team to pull off the score to end all scores, so she can buy back her freedom after her run-in with Zerek Besh, and the first 2 acts of the game are about Kay's efforts to assemble said team. And yeah, apart from ND5, the BX commando droid with a lot of attitude, a lot of these characters, especially when they're introduced, are just really bland. The main thread linking these events together is Kay and Nix, and they're definitely a great duo, and without them, I feel like the plot would just fall to pieces. Kay, especially in the back half of the game, is just a really strongly written character, fitting that scoundrel archetype so well, yet never straying from her strong moral foundation. But yeah, despite a couple of well-designed missions here and there, the plot is pretty threadbare and uninteresting. The craziest thing about all of this though, is that the final act of the game completely flips all of this on its head, delivering not just a compelling Star Wars story, but a genuinely exciting, heartfelt concluding chapter that not only recontextualizes the relationships that Kay has to her team, but delivered some twists and turns that cement her as a genuinely great protagonist. I don't understand how this came to be. It doesn't even make sense how good the end of this game is in comparison to the rest of it. And for a lot of people, yeah, the feeling of slogging through some pretty poorly written story missions to get to an absolutely crazy blockbuster of an ending is going to be way too much to ask. I totally get that. The game ends at a true high point. It's just an absolute travesty that it takes so long to get there. And I think that captures the essence of Star Wars Outlaws. While it reaches for so many different things, and I think genuinely makes good on a few of them, it's clearly held back by some really questionable design decisions. The combat, coming from a studio responsible for a few absolutely brilliant cover shooters, utterly fails to recapture any of that magic that Massive worked so hard to create. The stealth is just truly awful, not just forcing you to engage with it on many different occasions throughout the game, but adopting an archaic pass or fail structure that forces you to repeat some of the most frustrating sections of the game if you make even a single error. The writing, at least at the start of the game, is just mid, with boring, uninteresting quest-giving NPCs and terrible, stiff facial animations that somehow make the bad writing feel even worse. But its world, stunningly realized in gorgeous detail, the grungy criminal underbellies of these cities are presented in a way that is so captivating, truly capturing the hustle and the bustle of these spaces that no other Star Wars game has been able to do in quite the same way. Blasting across the open plains of Toshara on your speeder, sneaking through the narrow alleyways of Kijimi, nothing else feels quite like it, and in that way, Star Wars Outlaws really succeeds. Its attempt at meaningfully evolving Ubisoft's open world game design is at the very least a valiant effort, stripping back a lot of the meaningless bloat that has so obviously plagued these games for years, while still offering a lot of content for those that want it. Star Wars Outlaws feels lean and focused by comparison, and actively rewards you for engaging with the open world through a smartly designed progression system. It's a choice that will meaningfully push Ubisoft's tired design forward, and its conclusion rather shockingly flips the otherwise uninteresting and threadbare story on its head, delivering a compelling and genuinely thrilling Star Wars story, definitely worth experiencing, where its characters really come to life past the game's dull opening hours. But herein lies the problem. Star Wars Outlaws is entirely hindered by its potential. Had the core gameplay been stronger, I could easily recommend this to anyone, considering how strong it is in some other aspects. Had the story not taken 2/3 of the game to get going, you get me. There are so many things wrong here, many of which are fundamental to how a video game should function. Yet I'd be lying if I said I didn't walk away from Outlaws kind of having enjoyed myself. So I'll say this, there are a lot of problems here that will almost certainly bother a lot of people. They definitely bothered me. But even despite this, the game does get a lot right. This game will very likely be heavily discounted soon, and then there is definitely some value proposition, but it's entirely dependent on what you value as a player. If you know that the terrible gunplay and stealth is going to bother you, it's unlikely that its other systems will win you back. Star Wars Outlaws is an ambitious and fascinating mess of a video game. Its core gameplay can be shockingly bad at times, and its story takes way too long to find its footing, hindered more so by some incredibly poor facial animation. However, its vibrant world design, meaningful evolution of the open world structure, and that thrilling conclusion means that despite all of its shortcomings, there is definitely some good hidden beneath the surface, especially for fans of Star Wars. Thanks a bunch for watching. Let me know what you think down below. Are you just gonna write this one off completely? Gonna wait for a sale? I'd love to hear your thoughts. I would really appreciate it if you could subscribe and like the video if you liked it. As always, thanks again. Hope you have a wonderful day.